Welcome back to the deep dive. So today we are wrestling with a topic that is immense in scope and frankly absolutely critical for the safety and resilience of billions. And he's comprehensive disaster management. We have this formidable stack of sources here, academic papers, policy documents, data reports, and they're all attempting to synthesize these massive global resilience frameworks with the hyper-local, really specific risks you find in one of the world's most densely populated and vulnerable geographies, India.
Yeah, it's a huge, huge undertaking. And, the source material really shows the challenge isn't just dealing with the obvious high-intensity stuff like Himalayan earthquakes,
So
right?
like headline grabbers.
Exactly. But it's also these subtle, sort of slow-burn climate threats, the extreme heat waves we're seeing more of, the urban flooding, even these industrial legacies that just, refuse to disappear.
So our mission today really is to try and cut through some of the institutional jargon, the sheer volume of data, and deliver the foundational knowledge, the most critical insights that you, our listeners, need to understand the true path to preparedness and resilience.
Let's do it.
Okay, so let's unpack this immediately, starting with the core equation, because the sources are very clear on this. When we talk about a disaster, we're not just talking about hurricane or a flood in isolation. What's the fundamental human-centric definition we need to start with?
Yeah, the UN definition is really key here, and it shifts the focus entirely. A disaster is defined as a disruption, a serious disruption, actually, of a community's functioning involving widespread losses, human, material, economic, environmental. But, and this is the really vital part, it exceeds the ability of that community to cope using its own resources. So it's not just about the magnitude of the event itself. It's fundamentally a failure of human and societal capacity to manage it.
Right. So if the community can kind of absorb the shock, bounce back quickly using only its local resources, then it's not strictly a disaster. It's a hazard event.
That's it.
That shifts the entire mindset, doesn't it? From just act of nature to failure of capacity.
Precisely. And that definition immediately leads us to the three components that define disaster risk. The equation we really need to keep in mind throughout this deep dive.
Okay.
First, we have the hazard. Now, this is the potential source of harm. But as the sources clarify, the severity matters immensely. An earthquake is a hazard, sure, but the risk profile of a Richter 3 event is, virtually negligible compared to a Richter 8 event.
Right. You're talking about fundamentally different potential energy, different levels of destruction.
Completely different scale. It's not just the presence of a threat, but the magnitude of that potential force.
Got it. Hazard is the potential punch.
Yeah, good analogy. Next, we factor in vulnerability. This is defined as the underlying conditions. Could be physical, social, economic, environmental, even attitudinal factors. Things that increase the susceptibility of a community to that hazard's impact.
Okay, explain that a bit more. Attitudinal.
Well, think about evacuation orders. If there's a cultural resistance or deep mistrust of authorities, people might ignore warnings. That's an attitudinal vulnerability.
Right.
But more commonly, think physical. A massive population living in non-engineered, poorly constructed housing, they're physically vulnerable.
Right.
Or if they lack savings, insurance, social safety nets, they're economically and socially vulnerable. It means their capacity to cope, to bounce back, is just far lower.
So if the hazard is the potential punch, vulnerability is like the quality of your shield. It determines how much damage that punch is actually likely to inflict because of these pre-existing weaknesses.
That's a perfect way to put it. Absolutely perfect. And finally, we have to define exposure. This one's pretty straightforward. It's simply the number of people and assets, infrastructure, homes, businesses, that are actually located in the hazardous area.
So if a massive earthquake hits a completely uninhabited desert,
risk is zero. Exposure is zero. Exactly. So you put these three together and you get the foundational disaster risk formula, the potential for loss, hazard X, exposure X, vulnerability.
Hazard times exposure times vulnerability.
That's the one. And the entire goal of modern disaster management really is to strategically mitigate, to reduce any one of those three variables to bring down the overall risk.
Understanding that hazard X, exposure X, vulnerability equation, it really changes everything, doesn't it? It forces us to ask, how long did it actually take India to stop seeing disaster purely as, an act of God and start focusing on managing those human factors, the exposure and vulnerability?
Yeah.
Let's look at that historical shift in India's approach.
So the shift was long and pretty dramatic. Historically, particularly in the pre-intermediate post-independence era, the approach was overwhelmingly relief-oriented,
Purely reactive.
just cleaning up afterwards.
Pretty much. DM was essentially treated as a kind of welfare function managed by officials called relief commissioners. The whole process was cyclical. Wait for the crisis to hit, then mobilize aid, distribute supplies, food, blankets, and then basically move on until the next one.
So almost no focus on anticipation or prevention. Very little, if any. It was all about response.
But the sources trace a really clear pivot starting in the 1990s and then accelerating into the 2000s, driven largely by these massive high-impact disasters. You mentioned things like the 1999 Odisha supercyclone, the 2001 Booz earthquake. Those seem like real turning points.
Absolutely. These disasters were just so large, so costly, both in terms of human lives lost and the sheer economic damage, that the old reactive model just became completely untenable. It couldn't cope.
Scale's just too big.
Way too big. It forced this realization that merely responding wasn't enough. The country needed a proactive risk reduction approach. This transition involved shifting from managing single hazards in isolation, just floods or just earthquakes, to embracing a multi-hazard institutionalized framework.
Right. A more holistic view.
Exactly. And the core goals of this new modern DM approach became threefold. 1, reduce losses from hazards, lives, property, everything. 2, assure prompt assistance to those affected. And 3, achieve rapid and effective recovery. This whole proactive mindset ultimately culminated in the Disaster Management Act of 2005.
Okay, the DM Act of 2005. That sounds like the bedrock, the foundation establishing the entire institutional architecture we see today. So if we really want to be well informed on this, we need to know who actually does what. Can you detail that hierarchy established at the national level?
Certainly. So at the very top, the apex body is the NDMA, the National Disaster Management Authority. And importantly, it's chaired by the Prime Minister.
Okay, highest level oversight.
Right. The NDMA sets the overall policies, it generates the national plans, and it issues the guidelines that then filter down to the states and local levels. Supporting them is the NEC, the National Executive Committee, which is more about implementation coordination among ministries.
So NDMA sets the big picture policy, the legal and strategic landscape.
Precisely. Then you have the critical operational arms. There's the NCMC, the National Crisis Management Committee. This operates under the Cabinet Secretary, and it oversees the command, control, and coordination of the actual real-time response when a crisis hits. They're the central coordination hub during an emergency.
Okay, coordination. And then the most visible component on the ground, right? The specialized, trained professionals. That's the NDRF.
Yes, the NDRF, the National Disaster Response Force. They really are the boots on the ground. They're a specialized paramilitary force, specifically tasked with rescue, relief, and deep response operations. They directly assist state governments.
I've seen them mentioned in the sources as the Golden Hands.
That's right, yeah. It references their rapid deployment capability and their specialized skills, like in search and rescue. They've done international missions, too, like during the 2015 Nepal earthquake.
Impressive. And there's one more key body.
Yes. Finally, you have the NIDM, the National Institute of Disaster Management. This provides the sort of intellectual foundation. Human resource development, crucial training programs, research, and overall capacity building for the whole sector.
Okay, so this hierarchy, NDMA, NEC, NCMC, NDRF, NIDM, it looks very exhaustive, highly organized on paper. But, doesn't having 4 or 5 major bodies dedicated to this, doesn't that risk creating bureaucracy? Could it potentially slow down decision-making, especially in a really rapid onset crisis like a flash flood or a sudden earthquake tremor?
That's a highly pertinent question, and yes, it's one the sources absolutely address directly. The structure is designed to be comprehensive, right? Ensuring that policy setting, NDMA, is separate from operational coordination, NCMC, and the actual deployment, NDRF.
Makes sense on paper.
It does. However, one of the 3 major critiques leveled against the DM Act is indeed this heavy centralization of authority. While centralization aims to ensure coherence in policy across such a vast and diverse nation,
Which you probably need to some extent.
You do. But it often hampers the kind of local adaptation, the flexibility that's necessary for truly effective response and, importantly, for prevention.
Yeah, local conditions, local geography, local vulnerabilities, they really dictate what kind of planning is needed. Centralized policy can't always account for the unique risks of every single town or village.
Exactly right. The second major critique highlighted is financial. There are significant gaps in financial devolution, particularly getting funds down to the lower tier bodies, like urban disaster management authorities or UDMAs.
So the money doesn't always reach the front lines where it's needed most for local action.
That's often the case, yeah. Resilience really needs localized, predictable funding streams to function effectively, and that's frequently lacking, according to the analysis.
Okay. But the third critique, and this one feels arguably the most critical for our whole discussion on resilience, it speaks to a fundamental structural flaw, doesn't it, in how the system views risk itself. It's about the National Disaster Response Funds.
Yes, this is the core structural tension, and it's really important to grasp. The sources explicitly state that the National Disaster Response Funds are statutorily designated only for response, relief, and rehabilitation.
Only for after the event happens.
Correct. They are not intended for mitigation, prevention, or long-term risk reduction. This means that the entire financial engine of the national system is geared towards prioritizing the visible goals. The cleanup, the immediate aid, the recovery after the fact.
Rather than the foundational goals.
Exactly. The foundational goals are those long-term investments in things like better infrastructure, better land planning, early warning systems, the things that could have prevented the disaster in the first place, or at least drastically reduced its scale.
So it kind of perpetuates a reactive cycle rather than incentivizing proactive investment in resilience.
That's the fundamental criticism. It makes building long-term resilience much harder when the primary funding mechanism is locked into the response phase.
Wow. That structural imbalance between, fighting today's disaster and actively preventing tomorrow's, it makes the need for these global frameworks even more apparent, doesn't it? Let's shift our focus now to that international roadmap for resilience, which really culminates in the current global standard, the Sendai framework.
Absolutely. The global community recognized this tension quite some time ago, moving through several frameworks before Sendai. There was the Yokohama strategy back in 1994, which really focused on vulnerability reduction. And then came the Hyogo framework for action, which ran from 2005 to 2015. And the sources do note that these preceding efforts did actually demonstrate success.
Oh, really? In what way?
Well, they led to a noticeable reduction in disaster mortality globally. Fewer people were dying directly from hazards. And they also proved the cost-effectiveness of investing in disaster risk reduction, or DRR. It showed that spending on prevention actually saves money in the long run.
Okay, so progress was made. But as the world kept urbanizing and climate change obviously intensified, the economic losses just kept mounting, right? Even if mortality went down slightly.
That's exactly the problem. The human cost might have decreased in some areas, but the economic cost, the disruption, just kept climbing. That necessitated the transition to the much more comprehensive Sendai framework in 2015.
Right. Sendai.
Correct. The Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction runs from 2015 to 2030, and it sets the current global agenda. It really recognizes that DRR can't be separate from sustainable development. It has to be integrated. It focuses on tackling those underlying risk factors we talked about, vulnerability and exposure.
And it outlines 4 key priorities for action, right? These seem like the core pillars of modern DRR strategy.
They absolutely are. Let's walk through them. Priority 1 is understanding disaster risk.
Seems intuitive, but what specific actions does that actually mandate? It's more than just knowing there's a risk, presumably.
Oh, much more. Priority 1 is all about building comprehensive data and knowledge systems. It mandates the collection, analysis, and importantly, the sharing of relevant data, making sure non-sensitive hazard information is open source, for example.
Open data.
Yes, and systematically recording disaster losses so we actually know what these risks are costing us, economically and socially. But what's truly fascinating here, and a major policy shift from earlier frameworks, is the emphasis on promoting traditional, indigenous, and local knowledge alongside advanced tools.
Ah, that's interesting. So not just high-tech solutions.
No. For example, using geospatial technology to model flood paths is critical, obviously. But Sendai says it's also critical to understand traditional farming methods that might be drought-resistant, or local construction techniques that have withstood generations of specific hazards, like earthquakes in a particular region.
That makes sense. It recognizes that local populations often hold invaluable, context-specific knowledge that purely scientific models might miss entirely. Okay, priority 2 focuses on governance.
Priority 2 is strengthening disaster risk governance. This basically means DRR cannot be siloed away in just one emergency management agency. It has to be integrated across all sectors: health, education, urban planning, finance, agriculture, you name it.
Mainstreaming DRR.
Exactly. It calls for coherent legal frameworks and policies that guide both public and private actions towards reducing risk. And a crucial strategy here is ensuring strict compliance and enforcement of safety standards, especially in things like land use planning and building codes.
Because if DRR isn't mainstreamed into everyday development, you just end up rebuilding the same risks after every disaster.
Precisely. You lock in vulnerability for another generation.
Okay. Priority 3 seems to directly address that major funding critique we just discussed. Investing in DRR for resilience.
Yes. This priority mandates a shift in thinking. DRR investment is not just an expenditure, it is cost-effective savings in the long run. The sources strongly advocate for allocating necessary financial resources proactively. It also pushes for promoting disaster risk transfer mechanisms, things like insurance and financial protection instruments for governments and individuals.
Spreading the financial risk.
Right, and demanding that public and private investments in critical facilities, think schools, hospitals, transport networks, are inherently resilient right from the design stage. Don't build a vulnerable hospital. This kind of investment promotes long-term stability and even economic innovation.
Makes sense. And finally, priority 4 brings us back to the post-disaster cycle, but with a really foundational twist, this idea of build back better.
Priority 4 is enhancing preparedness for effective response, and crucially, using the recovery phase to build back better. This means recovery isn't just about replacing what was lost. It's seen as an opportunity.
An opportunity, how so?
An opportunity to actively reduce the existing vulnerabilities that the disaster exposed, and also to prevent the creation of new risks during reconstruction. Strategies here include updating preparedness plans based on real-world simulations and drills, strengthening early warning systems, and crucially, ensuring that critical infrastructure like power and water remains operational after an event to facilitate a faster, better recovery.
Okay, so that's the global roadmap from Sendai. How does India then translate this high-level global framework into a workable domestic strategy? That's where the National Disaster Management Plan, the NDMP 2019, comes in, right?
Exactly. The NDMP 2019 acts as India's dynamic national framework. It clearly aims to integrate prevention, mitigation, and DRR across all developmental activities and throughout the entire disaster cycle, pre, during, and post.
So it tries to break down those silos Sendai talks about.
Yes. And when you look at the thematic areas of the NDMP, things like understanding risk, capacity development, interagency coordination, financial arrangements, they are deliberately and strategically aligned directly with those 4 Sendai priorities. The plan tries to ensure that national policies regarding healthcare, education, infrastructure, etc., explicitly include DRR components. The idea is to make resilience a shared responsibility, not just the job of the emergency response guys.
Shared responsibility. Speaking of which, India has taken quite a leading role globally with the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, the CDRI. This isn't just domestic policy. It feels like a statement about global leadership in this area.
It really is quite remarkable. What's fascinating here is the speed and scope of the CDRI. It was launched by India in 2019. It's a multinational partnership headquartered right there in New Delhi, and it already counts something like 50 member countries plus international organizations.
Wow, that's fast growth. What's its central purpose?
Its core mission is to enhance the resilience of both new and existing infrastructure worldwide. Basically, to shift the global norm from just building cheaply and quickly to building smartly and resiliently.
Okay, tell me more about how this platform practically helps, though. How does just exchanging best practices actually help, say, a remote, small island developing state? SIs?
Well, the sources highlight that CDRI specifically aims to advance global equity by focusing on the most vulnerable regions, including SIs and also landlocked mountain states. For SADES, they have specific initiatives like IRIS, the Infrastructure for Resilient Island States.
IRIS, what does that do?
It focuses on practical, local solutions tailored for islands. So this could mean sharing best practices on how to retrofit critical infrastructure like ports or communication towers against rising sea levels and more intense cyclones, or developing integrated early warning systems linked to sea level rise data. It's about sharing know-how that's directly relevant.
Okay, tangible support.
Yes. And they also run the Infrastructure Resilience Academic Exchange, or IRX Fellowship. This drives collaborative research between experts from different countries to solve these complex, often localized infrastructure resilience problems, using global expertise but applying it locally.
Right, we've established the global and national frameworks. Now let's pivot to the immediate threats on the ground, starting with the one that is fundamentally changing our definition of risk: climate change, and specifically these extreme heat waves.
Yeah, the data points coming out on heat are Well, they're terrifying.
Yeah.
Not just abstract predictions anymore. The Lancet Countdown 2023, for instance, projects that heat-related deaths among the elderly are projected to rise by a staggering 370% by the middle of this century.
370%, that's huge.
It's enormous. And this isn't just about feeling uncomfortably hot. It's about hitting actual physiological limits. The WHO points out that wet bulb temperatures around 38.5 degrees Celsius are considered near the physiological limit of human survivability.
Okay, we really need to pause and explain that wet bulb temperature for the listener, because it's a critical concept and maybe not everyone's familiar with it.
Absolutely, good point. So the wet bulb temperature isn't just the air temperature you see on the news. It measures temperature combined with humidity. It basically reflects how effectively your body can cool itself through evaporation, through sweating.
Right.
When the wet bulb temperature reaches that critical threshold, let's say around 35 to 38.5 degrees Celsius, depending on the source and individual factors, it means the air is so saturated with moisture that your sweat literally cannot evaporate effectively.
So your body can't cool down.
It can't. Your core temperature starts rising uncontrollably, leading very quickly to heat exhaustion, then heat stroke, and potentially death, regardless of your age or physical fitness, if you can't get into a cooler environment. It's a complete failure of the body's natural cooling system.
Okay, that conveys the gravity perfectly, thank you. And what drives this vulnerability, especially in these rapidly expanding urban areas in India?
It's primarily the urban heat island effect, which is
Yeah.
massively compounded by decades of, frankly, poor land use planning.
Yeah.
As cities expand, natural landscapes, trees, soil, water bodies get replaced with concrete, asphalt, dark roofs. Materials that absorb and then re-radiate huge amounts of heat.
Creating these pockets of intense heat.
Exactly. And compounding this, the sources show major Indian cities have lost significant amounts of their natural heat sinks, their natural air conditioners, if you will. Delhi, for instance, lost about 50% of its water bodies. Pune lost nearly 32% just between 1999 and 2021.
Wow.
So when you destroy your natural cooling assets, lakes, wetlands, parks, even just tree cover, the city literally becomes a heat trap.
So how are cities trying to respond? What's the strategy?
Well, the primary strategy being rolled out is the implementation of heat action plans, or HAPs. These are now active across 23 states, apparently. These plans are multifaceted. They include structural measures, things like promoting cool roofs, using reflective paint or materials to bounce sunlight back, and increasing green infrastructure, like planting more trees and creating more parks.
Longer-term solutions.
Yes. But perhaps more immediately crucial are the non-structural measures. Things like establishing clear heat health threshold temperatures that trigger specific warnings and actions, issuing timely forecasts and heat alerts via bulk mobile messages, getting the word out quickly.
Right. Direct communication.
And setting up public cooling centers where people can escape the heat, ensuring access to free, safe drinking water points. This is about real-time, minute-by-minute risk management during a heat wave event.
Okay. Transitioning from the air to water risks now, let's discuss flooding, starting with urban flooding, which seems like a massive and growing vulnerability, especially with that urbanization statistic you mentioned earlier.
Absolutely. Given that projection, over 40% of the country's population living in urban areas by 2030, urban flooding is a critical issue. It's generally defined as waterlogging that occurs when the rate of rainfall runoff exceeds the capacity of the drainage system.
So the drains just can't cope.
Can't cope. And the core vulnerability is, again, fundamentally related to encroachment and poor planning. The sources state that major cities have lost something like 70–80% of their natural water bodies and drainage paths, what the analysis calls blue-green assets.
Blue-green assets, meaning water bodies and green spaces.
Exactly. Lakes, ponds, rivers, wetlands, even just natural depressions that used to absorb water. We've essentially paved over nature's plumbing system.
So when a heavy rainfall event occurs, the water has literally nowhere to go but up and out into the streets and homes?
Precisely.
What are the innovative solutions being implemented, or at least explored, to try and reverse this trend, or at least manage it better?
Well, the shift is definitely towards trying to integrate more natural management techniques back into the urban fabric. We see advanced predictive systems being developed, like Seaflow WS, that's the Chennai flood warning system, which aims to provide better forecast data for preparedness.
Okay, better warnings.
Yes. But more philosophically, there's a lot of discussion around adopting the sponge cities concept, which was pioneered in China.
Sponge cities. Tell me more.
The idea of a sponge city is to incorporate natural water management solutions directly into the urban design. Think things like creating more wetlands, rain gardens, bioswales, which are like vegetated ditches, using permeable pavements instead of solid concrete everywhere.
So the city itself acts like a sponge.
That's the goal. Instead of just forcing all the rainwater immediately into an overburdened concrete pipe system, the infrastructure itself is designed to absorb, slow down, clean, and even store rainwater naturally. It reduces the reliance on purely conventional, hard-engineered drainage.
That sounds like a fundamentally different approach to urban infrastructure design. Very interesting. Now, staying with water but moving to the mountains. Glacial Lake Outburst Floods, or GLOFs. We saw the devastation recently in Sikkim. This risk seems endemic to the Himalayan states.
It is. GLOF is the sudden, often catastrophic breach of a glacial lake. These lakes are typically dammed by unstable natural barriers made of moraine, which is basically rock debris left by a glacier, or sometimes by ice itself.
And what triggers these breaches?
They're often triggered by secondary events. An avalanche falling into the lake, a landslide, sometimes even just heavy rainfall or a cloudburst event causing the lake level to rise too quickly behind that unstable dam. The sources highlight the high vulnerability. One study identified 13 highly vulnerable glacial lakes just in Uttarakhand alone.
13 in just one state. Wow. What makes GLOF management uniquely challenging compared to, say, managing a regular river flood?
There are two main issues: detection and latency. Detection is incredibly difficult because these potentially dangerous lakes are located in very remote, high-altitude, often inaccessible terrain. So continuous real-time monitoring with sensors is expensive and technically challenging.
Hard to keep an eye on them constantly.
Very hard. And latency is the second big issue. Once a moraine dam breaches, the resulting surge of water and debris can travel incredibly fast down steep valleys, hitting vulnerable downstream communities within minutes, sometimes tens of minutes. That leaves extremely minimal time for effective early warning and evacuation.
Not much time to react at all.
Very little. That's why initiatives like the ISRO NRSC Glacial Lake Atlas 2023 are so crucial. They use satellite imagery to identify and map these high-risk glacial bodies from space, giving a baseline understanding of where the threats are.
But are there also structural solutions, ways to proactively mitigate the risk before a natural trigger event happens?
Yes, absolutely. The main structural measure discussed is controlled breaching or lowering of the lake level. This is a key proactive intervention.
How does that work?
Well, the most frequently cited successful case study is the Chorolpa Glacial Lake in Nepal, back in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Engineers constructed an outlet channel, basically a controlled drain, to artificially and slowly lower the lake level by about 17 meters.
17 meters, that's significant.
It is. It massively reduced the volume of water stored behind that fragile moraine dam. So it effectively reduced the potential magnitude of any future flood peak if the dam were ever to breach completely. It significantly lowered the risk for downstream communities.
Okay, moving from water to purely geological threats now. Let's focus on earthquakes. That vulnerability statistic you mentioned earlier is just astonishing. 59% of India's land area is prone to earthquakes.
It's a huge percentage. And that vulnerability is magnified because seismic risk fundamentally is an engineering problem. We know how to build structures that can withstand earthquakes, at least up to a certain magnitude.
So the knowledge is there.
The knowledge is definitely there. And while initiatives exist, like promoting indigenous earthquake-resistant housing designs, such as the traditional banga structures found in Gujarat, which performed well in the Bhuj earthquake, or doing seismic microzoning for major cities to understand local ground conditions better, the real Achilles heel of managing seismic risk in India, according to the sources, is the persistent failure of the techno-legal regime.
Okay, that term again, techno-legal regime. What exactly does that imply in the context of earthquakes? Is it just about the building codes themselves?
It's broader than just the codes. It refers to the entire system that's supposed to ensure seismic safety. It involved the technical engineering standards, yes, like the National Building Codes, which specify how buildings should be designed in different seismic zones, but it also includes the legal and administrative part.
Ah, the enforcement.
Exactly, the enforcement of those codes, the proper licensing and accountability of structural engineers, the building permit process, the inspections, the quality control of materials, the certification process upon completion.
And the sources suggest this whole system is weak.
That's the consistent critique. The consequence of weak enforcement is devastating. We know the standards exist for earthquake-resilient construction, but if they are ignored, if corners are cut, if unqualified people design buildings, if inspections are lax or corrupt, if licenses aren't enforced, then millions of people end up living and working in non-engineered, highly vulnerable structures.
And retrofitting those structures later is incredibly expensive, right?
Often financially prohibitive, especially on a large scale. So the risk gets effectively locked in, becoming permanent until the next major earthquake inevitably exposes it.
So that enforcement gap is where the vulnerability factor in the risk equation hazard X exposure X vulnerability remains stubbornly high for earthquakes.
Very much so. It's a critical governance failure.
Okay, let's touch briefly on coastal geological threats, tsunamis.
Right. The sources state 75% of India's extensive coastline is vulnerable to tsunamis, mainly from undersea earthquakes in the Indian Ocean. This requires a highly sophisticated warning infrastructure.
And how does India fare on that front?
Thankfully, the infrastructure is considered world-class. The Indian Tsunami Early Warning Center, ITDWC, located in Hyderabad, serves as the national warning center and also provides warnings to other Indian Ocean Rim countries.
Okay, strong on the warning system. What about preparedness on the ground in coastal communities?
Here, too, India seems to have implemented international best practices quite effectively, specifically the UNESCO IOC Tsunami Ready program.
Tsunami Ready. What does that program actually look like on the ground? Can you give us a concrete example from the sources?
Yeah, the sources highlighted successful implementation, particularly in coastal Odisha, which has faced cyclones and has tsunami risk. It's a really holistic approach. It includes structural preparation, like having clearly marked color-coded evacuation routes leading inland or to shelters, and making sure tsunami readiness is integrated with existing cyclone shelters, using them for dual purposes.
Smart, combining preparedness efforts.
Exactly. But crucially, it also involves non-structural, social preparedness. The sources emphasize things like conducting regular, realistic mock drills, often led by women within the community, ensuring that local leaders are trained, drills are practiced routinely. All of this builds community trust and understanding of the warning systems and evacuation plans.
So people know what to do when the siren goes off.
Precisely. Furthermore, there's an emphasis under the Coastal Regulation Zone, CRZ, guidelines on the importance of bioshields.
Bioshields, you mean like mangroves?
Exactly. Planting and maintaining protective belts of mangroves, casuarina forests, and other suitable coastal vegetation. These act as vital non-structural measures that can physically dissipate a significant amount of a tsunami's wave energy before it reaches inhabited areas. Nature-based solutions as part of the defense.
All right, for our final deep dive into specific hazards, we really have to confront the long shadow of industrial risk. And the sources use the tragic 40-year context of the Bhopal gas tragedy, the MIC leak in 1984, as a kind of case study for managing the ongoing, incredibly difficult legacy of toxic waste.
Yes, Bhopal is this constant, somber reminder that the consequences of a major industrial failure don't just end when the immediate crisis is over. They can last for generations. The complexity now lies in safely disposing of the legacy toxic waste still at the site we're talking about, contaminated soil, chemical residues, including things like naphthalene.
And this isn't like regular waste disposal, is it?
Not at all, because the waste poses such a persistent environmental and health threat, potentially for decades. Specialized, very high-cost disposal methods are absolutely mandatory. You can't just dump it in a landfill.
So what are the main waste disposal methods cited in the sources for dealing with this level of chemical toxicity?
There are three primary technical methods discussed. The first is highly controlled incineration, burning at extremely high temperatures. But this requires a sophisticated, multi-layer, typically 4-layer filtration system to capture and neutralize the harmful gaseous emissions. The remaining solid residue, the ash, then has to be safely placed in a specially designed, membrane-lined secure landfill to prevent leaching.
Okay, complex and expensive. What else?
Second is encapsulation. This involves encasing the contaminants inside a solid, chemically inert matrix, like mixing it into glass during vitrification, or stabilizing it within a specialized cement mixture. The goal is to physically immobilize the toxic components and prevent them from leaching out into the groundwater over time.
Locking them away physically.
Right. And the third main method is chemical neutralization. This uses specific chemical agents, often in specialized reactors or rotary kilns, to react with the hazardous compounds and break them down into less toxic or non-toxic substances.
Okay, these all sound like highly technical, definitely high-cost solutions, but the sources note that actually implementing them for the Bhopal waste has been constantly stymied by legal and social hurdles for years, decades even.
That's a real practical challenge. Legally, there have been endless delays and ambiguities in definitively determining liability for the cleanup costs, which often stalls the actual work on the ground.
Right, the legal battles drag on.
They do. And socially, perhaps the most potent challenge is the not in my backyard, or MBY phenomenon. Everyone agrees that this toxic waste needs to be treated, needs specialized facilities. But absolutely no community wants those treatment facilities sited anywhere near them, understandably feeling health risks or environmental contamination.
So finding a location is almost impossible.
It makes finding a politically and environmentally acceptable site extremely difficult, leading to continuous delays. And environmentally, the primary risks, if the waste isn't handled properly, are leachate, that's a contaminated liquid that can filter out of improperly stored waste, and the subsequent, potentially irreversible contamination of groundwater resources.
A nightmare scenario.
Absolutely. The sources stress that the only way forward really has to involve a non-negotiable, time-bound disposal plan mandated by the courts or government, and crucially, the implementation of real-time emission monitoring systems at any treatment facility to build public trust and ensure safety.
Okay. Shifting now to another major environmental risk, forest fires. The sources indicate these have seen a massive escalation, which feels intrinsically linked to climate change and increased vulnerability.
The severity has definitely multiplied. A shocking 36% of India's forest cover is now classified as fire-prone to some degree. And the sources cite a terrifying tenfold increase in the number of forest fire incidents detected over the last 2 decades.
Tenfold. That's huge. And the impact isn't just local, right?
No, it's global. These fires are estimated to be emitting around 69 million tons of CO2 annually, contributing significantly to greenhouse gas emissions, beside the devastating local impacts on biodiversity, soil, and livelihoods.
How do the causes break down? Are we talking mostly about natural ignition, like lightning, or is it mainly human error?
It's a mix, but the data clearly shows that man-made causes significantly outweigh natural ones. Natural fires are typically caused by lightning strikes, which happen but aren't the main driver.
So what are the common man-made causes?
They range from simple negligence, things like unattended campfires, carelessly discarded cigarettes or bidis, sparks from vehicles or machinery, to more deliberate actions like burning agricultural residue near forests, or sometimes even intentional burning for land clearing or perceived forest management benefits, like promoting certain types of grass growth. Mitigation involves advanced monitoring, like ISRO's FAST 3.0 Forest Fire Alert System, which uses satellite data, and also legislative safeguards under the Indian Forest Act.
Is there a successful model cited in the sources that demonstrates effective mitigation, particularly of these human-caused fires?
Yes, the Andhra Pradesh model is consistently cited as a successful, replicable strategy. They apparently documented a significant 21.83% year-on-year reduction in forest fire incidents in their state.
That's impressive. How did they achieve that?
Primarily through non-structural measures. They focus heavily on intense public awareness campaigns targeting communities living in and around forests, explaining the dangers and causes of fires. And crucially, they invested significantly in the creation and maintenance of fire lines.
Fire lines. Explain what those are.
A fire line is essentially a strategic break in the combustible forest material. It's a cleared path, vegetation, dead leaves, branches are removed down to the mineral soil designed to physically stop or at least slow down the movement of a ground fire. It effectively contains the risk, makes the fire more manageable for response teams, and prevents small fires from becoming uncontrollable large ones.
So it's about interrupting the fuel supply for the fire.
Exactly. The success in Andhra Pradesh really demonstrates that community engagement, awareness, and relatively simple, planned interventions like fire lines can be highly cost-effective tools in reducing fire risk.
Okay. Finally, let's address a unique but tragically devastating hazard that falls more into the administrative and social risk category. Stampede management. The sheer scale of the risk in India is stark. The sources state India records the highest number of stampede-related deaths globally, something like 3,000 deaths, just between 1996 and 2022.
It's a horrifying statistic. And stampedes are almost always a failure of prediction, planning, and management. They typically arise from a confluence of factors. On one hand, you have administrative weaknesses, poor crowd control planning, maybe a lack of advanced risk assessment for the event or venue, weak enforcement of safety regulations or capacity limits.
Not enough planning for the number of people.
Right. And on the other hand, you often have infrastructure deficits, things like narrow passages, creating bottlenecks, sudden merging of crowds, poor or confusing signage, insufficient emergency exits. The complexity requires deep preventative assessment before large gatherings.
So what specific tools or approaches are required to manage this kind of risk proactively rather than just reacting when panic sets in?
Well, the management guidelines within the NDMP actually focus on using specialized assessment tools like failure mode and effect analysis, or FMEA.
FMEA. How does that apply to crowd management?
FNEA is a systematic technique used in engineering and safety analysis. For crowd management, it requires event managers to break down the entire event process and infrastructure into components, like barricades, entrance gates, ticketing systems, signage, staffing levels, crowd flow routes. Then, for each component, they have to ask, what are the potential ways this could fail? What would be the effect of that failure? How likely is it to happen? And how severe would the consequences be?
So mapping out potential failure points in advance.
Exactly. For example, they might analyze a narrow exit gate and identify a potential failure mode as gate collapse due to crowd pressure. They'd then rate the severity, potentially catastrophic, the likelihood, maybe high if crowd density is expected to be extreme, and the detectability. Can we monitor the pressure? By identifying these potential high-risk failure points before the event, they can prioritize specific structural and non-structural mitigation measures.
Okay, so FAA provides the data to drive the structural solutions, like ensuring multiple, wide exit routes, using properly rated and reinforced barricades, improving signage visibility. What about managing the human psychological element, the panic itself?
That's where the non-structural measures and insights from behavioral science become crucial. The sources emphasize implementing comprehensive crowd management plans that consider flow dynamics. Things like using mandatory online registration or time ticketing to restrict entries and manage density, ensuring crowd numbers stay within the venue's safe capacity, deploying sufficient well-trained security and stewards, and importantly, having adequate emergency medical services readily available.
Makes sense. Preparedness.
Yes, and crucially, the sources also mention applying ServiQual models to the overall event experience.
ServiQual. What's that?
ServiQual is a model typically used in service quality management, but it's highly relevant here. It focuses on the gap between expected service and perceived service across dimensions like tangibles. Are the facilities clean? Is signage clear? Is there adequate waiting space? Reliability. Is the process predictable? Are timings adhered to? Is it hassle-free? Responsiveness. Are staff helpful and quick to assist? Assurance. Do staff seem knowledgeable and inspire confidence? And empathy. Do staff show care and provide individual attention, maintaining a non-hostile attitude?
So managing the experience to reduce stress.
Exactly. By actively managing waiting times, reducing points of frustration, ensuring clear communication, providing shade and water in queues, and generally creating a less stressful, more organized environment. Event organizers can actively reduce the underlying anxiety and potential for panic that often triggers stampedes. It's essentially disaster management through applied human psychology and good service design. Hashtag tag outro.
Wow. This deep dive has really provided an extensive view, hasn't it? Into the frameworks, the complex institutional architecture, and also the necessary technical specificity required for managing such diverse hazards. Everything from the immediate response needed for something like a stampede to the generational climate adaptation required for extreme heat waves. The core insight, though, seems to remain crystal clear. Effective disaster management has to fundamentally shift beyond just mere reaction. It needs to embrace comprehensive risk reduction, and that requires substantial proactive investment and, crucially, rigorous compliance and enforcement across all sectors.
And that brings us right back, doesn't it, to that central dilemma, the structural contradiction that the source material suggests we really have to confront. We detailed earlier how the DM Act of 2005's financial structure seems to heavily centralize funds towards response, relief, and rehabilitation. The visible post-event goals.
Right.
While explicitly excluding, or at least significantly limiting, dedicated national funding streams for mitigation, prevention, and long-term risk reduction, those foundational pre-event goals.
Yeah, that systemic bias towards the cleanup rather than prevention. It just seems like such a costly policy choice in the long run, both economically and in human terms.
It absolutely is. So here is the crucial question, the provocative thought perhaps for you, the listener, to consider and maybe research further. Given this acknowledged structural financing gap at the national level for proactive work, how can local government bodies, those urban DMAs, the regional authorities, the municipalities, how can they effectively bridge that difference? Where does the money for local mitigation actually come from consistently?
That's a tough question.
It is. And if these really crucial, preventative, resilient infrastructure projects, like building that sponge city infrastructure we talked about, or rigorously enforcing seismic building codes through proper inspections, or retrofitting vulnerable schools, these are primarily dependent on already stretched state budgets or local finances, rather than specific, dedicated national disaster mitigation funds. Then how can that core Sendai principle of Build Back Better ever be universally and successfully applied across all vulnerable communities? especially the poorest ones.
That really is the challenge, isn't it? Moving from policy intention, from frameworks on paper, to funded, implemented reality on the ground, everywhere it's needed. We hope this deep dive has given you the knowledge to better understand these complex issues and maybe even advocate for a more resilient future in your own context. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.